Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Reserved Investments, and thank you for joining me. So what I want to talk about in this video is the market dynamics between modern era Pokemon cards and products and that of vintage era Pokemon cards and products. As some of you are aware, we are going through, and recently went through, a massive speculative frenzy for modern era cards. This is evident by any of the posts on online collecting forums, on Facebook groups. I'm sure that some of you out there have seen some of the crazy TikTok videos, YouTube videos, where people are pretty much plowing over each other just to get new store shipments of a lot of these modern era Pokemon products. And now we can kind of see, as we go further out, the foundation of this development is starting to crack, meaning a lot of the latest Pokemon sets are not having the same hype, the same sellout mania as, say, Prismatic Evolutions. All trends eventually come to an end. Now, obviously, if you're smart, if you're intellectually capable of understanding these markets, if you have the means to take advantage of these trends and you understand the opportunity cost of doing so, by all means, you do you. Over the long term, however, I think in most cases, vintage Pokemon products are a better investment. Again, talking about the long term. Now, over the short term, you can make a case when we talk about speculation in the antiques and collectibles trade. Obviously, the easy money, the best money to make is over the short term. So if you're somebody that has access to these products and you're not one of these Timmys, Kimmys, and Poindexters that is going out of their way, spending hours upon hours of their time, going to each one of these stores when they put out new product and fighting people for it, then if you have the right mindset, you can make money in modern era Pokemon cards. But what you have to understand, and again, I'm just repeating what I've said in other videos up until this point right now in the video. But what you got to understand is that everybody is pretty much hoarding this stuff. There is mass speculation across the board in modern era Pokemon products. As a result, I consider the overall potential for a lot of these products when we go out 10, 20, 30 years in the future to be limited because everybody is hoarding this stuff in mass. If we look at the population reports of graded vintage cards, if we look at factory sealed vintage product, there is less of that out there. And there is a more sustainable demand for those products simply because people were not hoarding Pokemon products back in the day like they are now. Another factor you have to consider is the cultural relevance of this particular collectible. As I've said before many times on this channel, Pokemon has a lot of organic collectability. Pokemon at this point, the vintage stuff is always going to be considered iconic. It's just like if we look at collecting Star Wars toys. Obviously, the coveted vintage Kenner toy line, the figures and play sets that were produced from roughly 1977/1978 all the way up to 1984 is going to be the coveted vintage toys when we talk about Star Wars that collectors and investors are going to go after. So this is how you have to really analyze this market from that standpoint. Case in point, let's talk about one of the most popular cards that was readily available in Prismatic Evolutions. And when I say readily available, I don't mean that it was easy to get. I mean that everybody knew about it. If you were going to crack open Prismatic Evolutions, obviously you wanted the Umbreon EX card. Now, if we look at current PSA population reports and we analyze how many of these cards are out there, we can see that just in all grades, PSA has already certified close to 6,700 of these cards. And there are currently 2,464 Umbreon EX cards from Prismatic Evolutions in PSA 10 condition alone. Now keep in mind, there's a lot of people out there that went after Prismatic Evolutions, and they consider it to be a great investment. So they're not going to crack those boxes. So we really don't know how many cards up until this point of this Umbreon EX are out there in full existence. Now let's compare this to a card like some of my favorite vintage Pokemon cards, like a Blaine's Charizard from Gym Challenge. First edition, PSA 10. We know right now there's roughly 419 of these in existence. So you can already see the difference in population reports from some of the coveted vintage cards versus that of some of the more modern cards. And also another point that I want to make is, if you look at the prices that were being paid for Umbreon EX from the coveted Prismatic Evolution set in PSA 10, you're going to notice that a lot of people that were investing in that card early on, that card already lost a little bit more than 50% of its value. So that is a risk that you take when you invest in modern era Pokemon cards. Now, if you go online, you're going to see all types of reports where, well, Sean, try to get a Umbreon EX. Try to pull it from a factory sealed box of Prismatic Evolutions. You're absolutely right. The pull rates are horrible. But it doesn't mean this card is quote unquote rare. You have to take that into account with how much of this product is being hoarded in mass, and also how many cards have already been graded by a lot of the major grading companies. Now, I'm quoting you numbers just from PSA because, in all honesty, as a vintage Pokemon collector, really all I care about are the population reports that are put out by PSA, because I tend to go after, if I'm going to invest in vintage Pokemon cards, I go after vintage PSA 10 graded Pokemon cards. Now let's look at another one of my favorite vintage Pokemon cards. Let's talk about a first edition Dark Charizard Holo from the Team Rocket set. This card in PSA 10 condition, graded by PSA, there's roughly 556 in existence. And if we're looking at the total population report provided by PSA, all these cards graded, meaning all of these first edition Dark Charizard Holo cards from Team Rocket, there's roughly 9,800 of them in existence. So you can see, when we look at vintage cards, if you're investing in vintage Pokemon over the long term, you want to go after the coveted cards, if possible, in PSA 10 condition, because that's what other investors are attracted to. That's the stuff that's going to hold value long term. This is why I get into so many debates with Pokemon collectors who tell me, Sean, vintage is dead. It's really not doing anything. Well, if you've been paying attention over the last few months, a lot of vintage cards have popped in value. Case in point, in one of the videos on this channel, I think where I talk about you can beat the S&P 500 index by investing in collectibles, but there is a catch. I did a video and I filmed it in my Lego room. I hold up a PSA 10 first edition Blaine Charizard from the coveted Gym Challenge set. And I think I even state in that video, I think I paid like $3,800 for that card at that particular point in time. Well, right now, there's a couple that are trending for well over $6,000 at present time. There's a lot of opportunity in vintage cards, whereas we have more information available when it comes to population reports, when it comes to understanding the investment market for those cards, than we do versus that of modern cards. Now, modern cards are exciting simply because the market is very volatile, it's very speculative, it's all over the place. And as a result, if you are one of these Timmys, Kimmys, and Poindexters out there that unfortunately don't have any other better options to make money, meaning either at a corporate job that pays you $30, $40, $50, $60 or more per hour, or whatever else you're doing, and you're standing in line at these stores pushing kids out of the way to get this stuff. Yes, there is opportunity there, but it's limited and unpredictable over the long term. So my question to a lot of you, why would you hoard mass modern Pokemon cards and products when there is still opportunity and investment over the long term in vintage? And this is something that you yourself have to answer. There is really no right answer here. If you really think that the current speculative frenzy, the trend that we're seeing in Pokemon cards, where every time the company releases new products, it's going to sell out, people are going to pay 2, 3, 4 times the amount of the going retail price on eBay and other online sites, I don't think that trend is going to continue. And when the dust settles, it's going to take years to sort out how many of these cards are truly, truly scarce. Notice I did not use the term rare, because I'm telling you right now, just by analyzing this market, your Umbreon EX that came out of Prismatic Evolutions is never, ever going to be considered rare or scarce. There's already too many out there in existence. Now, that doesn't mean it still can't sell for a premium on the secondary market. Case in point, on this channel, we of course talk a lot about different collecting categories. And one of the markets that I also cover on this channel in depth is the market for vintage graded comic books. Now, if you know anything about the vintage comic book marketplace, there's a lot of popular titles that sell for extremely high prices that are not rare, they're just in demand. Case in point, if we look at the population reports for Amazing Spider-Man 300. Now, if you don't pay attention to the vintage comic book marketplace, Amazing Spider-Man 300 features the first appearance of Venom, which of course is one of Spider-Man's major nemesis in that particular series. That book came out in 1988. It's considered a Copper Age key. This is probably going to shock some of you that don't follow comic books. There are a little over 39,000 issues of that book that have been graded by CGC across all grades, across all different categories. So that includes universal grade, that includes signature series, qualified, restored, whatever it is. But here's the rub. In CGC 9.8 condition alone, there are well over 1,700 known copies of that book, and there are 10 in 9.9 condition alone. Now, during the pandemic, this was one of the comic books that I was warning people not to put their money in specifically. The price shot up, where a 9.8 condition copy of that book touched $10,000 at one point. Today, I really hate to tell you this, you can easily get that book for anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 if you know where to look, if you know what dealer to pretty much tap on the shoulder and say, hey, can you sell me a CGC 9.8 condition copy of Amazing Spider-Man 300? Most dealers will probably sell you that book right now for under $2,500. This is why when we look at the antiques and collectibles trade, and more specifically the collectibles trade, vintage, true vintage pieces are always a better investment over the long term. For far too long now, the Pokemon community seems to think they're bucking the trend here, where the modern stuff is always going to have more demand, more value in the future than that of the real authentic vintage pieces. There is virtually no other collecting category out there, all things being equal, where modern products, modern collectibles, are significantly always selling for a higher price than that of their vintage counterparts. This is why I warn you about mass speculation in these markets. Again, there's nothing wrong with speculating in these markets. There's nothing wrong with diversifying capital in these markets. I do it myself. That's the whole point of this channel. I teach collectible finance. But if you are one of these Timmys, Kimmys, or Poindexters who seems to think that at some point vintage cards are going to cease to have demand on the secondary market, and modern cards are going to overtake them over the long term, you are sorely mistaken. Do what you want with this information, but please understand the opportunity over the long term, let me repeat myself, over the long term, meaning 10 years out or more, is in the vintage stuff. It is not in this mass-produced modern stuff, especially given the fact that demand for Pokemon products is at an all-time high right now in the year 2025. Always remember, I don't know about you, my crystal ball is a little bit cloudy, but if I was a betting man and somebody put a gun to my head and said, Sean, do you think demand for Pokemon products is going to increase or decrease over the next 10 years? I would honestly say decrease. Because right now, one of the hottest markets in the trade is the market for Pokemon cards, and more specifically, modern era Pokemon cards. And on a side note, if you want to know what two other hot markets on the collectible side of the equation are right now, the market for graded vintage toys, with obviously vintage Kenner Star Wars leading the way, and also the market for sports trading cards and related memorabilia. So please learn from this. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And please learn how to analyze population reports when you're looking at some of these items to invest in, especially over the long term. If you need help, there's a plethora of videos on this channel. I also write about this stuff in my articles for Antiques and Auction News. Please, it costs you nothing to check out those articles free of charge. It costs you nothing to watch some of these videos. Get an education on how these markets actually work and what the crux is behind true classic collectible finance. How we allocate capital to the antiques and collectibles trade with the hope, with the goal of making a profit either over the short term or over the long term. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next coming video.